Hello one and all, a very warm welcome to another instalment from the channel that is Jono's Graveyard Jaunts. In today's episode, I'm once again in the huge and beautiful county that is Yorkshire. Specifically, I'm in the city of Bradford, and as I narrate this video, I shall be walking around Scornmoor Cemetery in the city, which is where the person who is the topic of today's video is laid to rest. Now, the first map shows where the county of Yorkshire sits in relation to the UK, and the second map shows where the city of Bradford sits in relation to Yorkshire itself. Now, the person who features in today's video had both a varied and an interesting career. He initially became a policeman, then an executioner or hangman, and finally an evangelist minister. Now, when we think about hangman, the most famous person who springs to mind is Albert Pierpoint, who hung John Haig, the acid bath murderer, John Christie, also known as the Reington Place Strangler, and Ruth Ellis, who was the last woman to be hanged in the UK before capital punishment was finally abolished. Now, a few really interesting facts about this person. When he became an executioner or hangman, he perfected what we call the long drop form of hanging a person, a technique that was originally developed by a man called William Marwood. However, the most interesting fact about this person for me is that he hung a man by the name of William Bury, who many thought, including the man who is the focus of the video today, was Jack the Ripper. Without a doubt, probably the most gruesome and famous murder case of all time. Now, as we all know, it was never actually solved and took place in the Victorian East End of London, known as the Whitechapel area. Now, the person who features in today's video is a man by the name of James Berry, who during his career as an executioner, which ran for a period of 8 years between 1884 and 1891, hung a total of 131 people, including 5 women. So, who was James Berry then? Where was he born, and how did he perfect the long drop method of hanging a person? Now, James Berry was born in Heckmondwike in Yorkshire on the 18th February 1852 and was the 13th of 18 children. He perfected the long drop method of hanging by calculating the actual length of rope required in order to ensure a clean break, to therefore try to ensure a quick and much less painless way of dying, thus trying to ensure an immediate end rather than being strangled by the rope and the actual death taking much longer therefore. James Berry pursued many careers as a young man, even embarking on a ship with the intention of emigrating to Australia, but because of his impulsive nature, he changed his mind before setting sail. In 1874, he joined the West Riding Police Force and settled in Bradford with his bride Sarah Ackroyd. Now, during his time as a constable, a mutual friend introduced him to William Marwood, a cobbler and part-time executioner who was famous for hanging Charles Pearce, Dr. Lamson and Kate Webster, to name but a few. Now, Berry had always had an interest in hanging, and with his newfound friend would spend many hours discussing the scientific principles. He learned the new technique of the long drop and also some tricks of the trade. Now, Marwood told Berry that it was essential to give the prisoner confidence and to assure him that his end would be swift. Now, Berry retired from the police in 1882 and surprisingly did not become Marwood's assistant. It wasn't until Marwood died in 1883 that Berry considered the possibility of becoming an executioner. Now, he knew that Marwood had taught him a great deal and instilled in him that the idea that the executioner's job was in no way degrading or indeed dishonourable. He decided to apply to the City of London for the vacant position, and there were some 1,400 applications, and the sheriffs eventually weeded out the obvious madmen and sadists and came up with a shortlist of 20. Unfortunately for Berry, a certain Bartholomew Binns was appointed this time, and this in no way disheartened Berry, who perhaps at the time wanted the job mainly for financial reasons. Carrying out a death warrant meant that at £10 a time he could make at least £250 a year and maybe as much as £350. Undeterred, he then offered his services to the magistrates in Edinburgh who required the death sentence to be carried out on two miners who had murdered two gamekeepers. Now, Berry travelled north and was put through a third-degree interrogation by the prison governor, who wanted to establish Berry's knowledge. When satisfied that Berry would carry out the executions in a humane manner, he agreed that Berry should have the job. Now, Berry spent the next 2 days in virtual isolation, and during this time he could not sleep and began to have doubts as to whether he had the necessary nerve for carrying out his duty. His dreams at this time were of the things going wrong. A feeling of great relief swept over him when he realised that he had made the correct calculation for his first job and that the two men had died instantaneously. He obtained excellent testimonials from the Edinburgh prison, so when Binns' reign as executioner ended, Berry's references meant he could then succeed without competition. Now, Berry was indeed a first of a new type of executioner. He never also referred to himself as a hangman. Hangings were no longer public, and later the press were also excluded. Berry was himself literate and very communicative. Officially, he was only asked to hang the prisoner until he was dead. It did not matter how long it took and what the cause of death was, but Berry set himself two objectives. Firstly, to reduce the preparation time so that the prisoner's ordeal would be over sooner, and secondly, to produce instant death by dislocation and not strangulation. To this end, Berry became the scientist. He improved on Marwood's rough table of drops by practicing with bags of cement, and he pressed for the standardisation of prison gallows and trapdoors. However, despite his conscientious efforts, many executions were to go wrong. Finally, Berry was haunted by nightmares. Once James Berry had been a teetotaler, but by the end of his career he was drinking a great deal. He was no longer a genial person and had become very short-tempered, especially with the press. In 1891, he became the first executioner to resign. And this followed a particularly disastrous hanging in Liverpool when Berry had to give way to the prison medical officer regarding the official scale drop. The unfortunate prisoner John Conway had his head almost completely severed. On this occasion, the press had been witnesses, and following all the furore, Berry tendered his resignation to Henry Matthews, the Home Secretary, although in point of fact he was not employed by the Home Office. So, rather than becoming unemployable, as he had first thought, he was asked to talk in America, and strangely his lectures would be against capital punishment. His trip to the US was, however, not as successful as lucrative as he would have liked to have hoped, and so he returned to Bradford. His failure in America can be attributed to the fact that his lectures were prepared for him and he did not seem convincing. But when he toured Great Britain, things were very different. He was then able to talk in his own simple way about his experiences. He even took with him magic lantern slides depicting convicts, pinioned prisoners, views of prisons and methods of execution in other countries. He still harboured feelings of guilt, however. Although he had never commented publicly on whether he thought a prisoner was guilty or innocent, he did have personal doubts. His house was full of pictures of his victims, and they were a constant reminder to him. One day, feeling particularly low, a chance meeting at the Midland Railway Station with a young man led James to pouring out his heart to the man. Now, the listener invited Berry to Rowland Street Mission, and it was here that James' conversion took place. It was announced that, and I quote, Mr. Berry fully surrendered himself to God, accepted the precious gift, and was at once filled with rest and joy. Berry then embarked on a career of revivalist meetings. Although he now believed capital punishment should be abolished, he was not ashamed of his past work. For instance, he did not ask for his waxworks to be removed from the Chamber of Horrors, but on the contrary would sometimes visit Madame Tussauds and look in on himself. Following his retirement, Berry toured as an evangelist and gave lectures on phrenology, which is essentially, it's a study of the cranium, which is essentially that part of the skull that houses the brain. Berry died at Walnut Tree Farm, 36 Bolton Lane, Bradford, West Yorkshire, on the 21st of October 1913. And as stated in the video, I actually went up to Bradford to record at the cemetery, but sadly it was closed. So I got the footage from an alternative cemetery. But obviously, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching. Please like, subscribe and comment.